Hello, my name is Bill Child. I'm a philosopher at the University of Oxford. And these are my colleagues, Matt Williams, who does politics, and Chris Bowdler, who's an economist. And we're here with a short video about admissions interviews for the PPE course. I'll talk a little bit about philosophy, then Matt about politics, and Chris about economics. So here we go with something about philosophy interviews. Well, just some basics or background. First of all, we don't expect you to have studied philosophy at your school or college. So we're not using interviews to try to find out what, if anything, you already know about philosophy, because we're not expecting that you will already have studied it. That's what we're not doing. What we do want to do is to give you a chance to work through some problems that will require you to think carefully and systematically, and to use the kinds of thinking skills that are important in studying philosophy. I'd say there's no set format for a philosophy interview. Different interviewers will organize things in different ways. And that's, we're not trying to make it difficult, but that's a little bit like if you've ever had a job interview, there's no set format for job interviews. It's not that every job interview takes the same format. So it's like that with philosophy interviews. But that said, there are two kinds of ways that a philosophy interview at Oxford might proceed, which are followed by quite a lot of people. So many interviewers will arrange things by giving you a short written passage to read before the interview, and then most of the interview time will be spent talking about that problem. And an alternative model is that some interviewers will get you to come into the room and they will start the interview by explaining a problem to you and asking you some questions about it and taking it from there. So I will just give you a couple of examples of how an interview might go for philosophy following both those models. So this would be a written problem. They might give you this problem to think about outside the room. I'll just read it through quickly, but then you could pause the video and read it at your leisure and have a think about it. So here's the situation. Ms. 1, 2, 3, and 1,000 are 1,000 rationally self-interested agents. Each of them is in a booth whose number corresponds to her name. They each know the number of the booth in which they're sitting, but they can't communicate with the others, and each of them knows that they'll never interact with the others once they leave the booths. And over the intercom comes a public announcement from Ms. Reliable. It is common knowledge that Ms. Reliable always tells the truth and always keeps her promise. And this is what she says. In each of your booths, there's a £1 coin and a keyboard. You may either keep the pound or exchange it for an opportunity to type the sentence, "There's someone with a booth number less than mine who's also typed this sentence." If the statement thus produced is true, you receive £1 million. If the statement thus produced is false, you receive nothing. All those who choose to type will type at noon. Okay, now, then suppose you are Ms. 1000. Should you type the sentence at noon? So I'm saying that that's what you've got on the piece of paper that you're reading in advance, and you're going to think about it. And the question is going to be, should you type the sentence at noon? So then here are some questions that we might ask you in the interview. So the first thing, we'd probably first ask you just to talk us through your understanding of the problem, just to check that we're all on the same page. And then we'd ask you whether you're going to type the sentence or not. We say, well, what's your reason for deciding to type the sentence, if that's what you decided, or deciding not to? And we'd often ask you, can you think of an argument for doing the other thing? Because we're interested not just in what you think is the right answer, but your ability to think about alternative answers. And then here would be some possible follow-up. So suppose you decided that you would type the sentence. You think, well, how much money would you expect to receive? And then, would your decision have been different if you'd been number 10 rather than number 1000? Or would your decision have been different if you'd been number 5 or if you'd been number 2? Because remembering that you're going to get the £1 million if someone with a number lower than yours has also typed the sentence. And you can think about what you'll be thinking if you were number 2. Or alternatively, suppose you come into the interview, so you've decided that you would type the sentence, that you decide not to type the sentence, rather. So what, if anything, did you need to assume about the other people in order to reach that decision? So you've been told in the setup that all the people are rational and self-interested, but do you know whether each of the others knows that everyone else is also rational and self-interested. So you could think about it like this. Suppose that you're number 10 and you don't know whether each of what numbers 1 to 9 knows that all the others are rational and self-interested. Might that affect your decision? So that's the kind of way that the conversation might go, and there'd be follow-ups and would be interested in exploring different alternatives. But I hope that sort of gives you an illustration of what it might be like if you were at an interview where you'd read a little puzzle or a problem outside the room. Then here's a second sort of example where you just come into the room and they ask you a straight question. So here's what they might say. Suppose you're traveling home by bus one day. Your bus leaves at 3:15. You get to the bus station, you look up at the clock and it shows 3 o'clock. So, and you believe it. You believe that the time is now 3 o'clock, and you're right. The time actually is 3 o'clock. But suppose that the clock has stopped, so the hands haven't moved for 12 hours. Do you know that it's 3 p.m. in that scenario? And then again, some questions that we might ask in the interview that followed. So you've given an answer. You've either said, yeah, you do know that it's 3 o'clock, or you don't. Well, we'd want to know what your reasons were for giving that answer. Could you think of reasons for saying the opposite thing? And if you said that you don't know that it's 3 o'clock in the situation we've described, can you think of anything that we could add to the situation to make it the case that you do know that it's 3 o'clock, and how would that make a difference? Or alternatively, if you said that you do know it's 3 o'clock in the situation I described, we might say this: well, suppose you'd arrived at the bus station 5 minutes later. What would you have believed about the time in that case? And does that change your original answer? So, and then the conversation would go on from there with further follow-ups. But that is just supposed to give you a quick idea of the sorts of things that we might ask. And I would emphasize that what I said at the beginning, we're not expecting you already to know philosophy. So we're just interested in how you think about the problem and the sorts of reasons that you give, and how easy you find it to think about alternative possibilities. So that's it for philosophy, and I'll hand over to Matt, who's going to say something about interviews that you might get in politics.
Thank you, Bill. Yes, indeed. So very similar to Bill's point that we're not anticipating any foreknowledge of philosophy, same applies to politics. We don't expect people to have studied it before. Most people haven't studied politics before. Most people that come to interview have an interest and enthusiasm for politics and in its various forms. But you don't need to know at your fingertips a whole range of facts. And ultimately, that's one of the points of an interview at Oxford, is that it's not a test of knowledge, but a test of your thinking skills. And those thinking skills we expect to be not fully formed yet. Otherwise, there'd be little point in seeking to educate you at the university. So it is not a problem if you are not entirely confident with your thinking skills or your abilities, because of course that's the point of an education. So even if there are some gaps in your capabilities, that's to be expected. Feeling a bit nervous is entirely understandable and normal, and we don't hold it against you. So if you are feeling terribly uncomfortable and anxious, well, of course, we'll try and encourage you to feel more comfortable and relaxed, but it is not a problem. There are various other sort of myths about Oxford interviews in general and PPE interviews in particular that I feel is worth dispelling, such as there is no archetypical PPE student. They don't look or sound in any particular way. And so we're not assessing someone according to any demographic criteria, their gender, their race, their faith, the part of the country or the world that they come from. None of these factors are relevant. So provided that you dress in whichever way you feel comfortable and that you comport yourself in whatever way you feel comfortable, that is absolutely fine. There are no expectations that you need to meet with regard to who you are as a person. Then with regard to the interview structure, politics, because it has various subdisciplines, may emphasize one or other of those particular subdisciplines. So I am from the more practical, empirical side of politics. In other words, how politics actually tends to operate in the world. And so I would tend to ask you questions that might help you gauge that. But again, with the proviso that I don't expect you to know specific details about the political organization in particular countries. My colleagues might focus a bit more on the political theory side of things, which is to do with how politics could, should, or might be organized, but not necessarily is organized at present. So let me just give you an example of what might happen. It's not unusual at all for or political scientists to use some data to share with you to gauge your thinking skills. So here's an example, and please sort of excuse me craning into the computer, but I'm half blind, so it might be a little bit sort of off-putting, but I hope not too much so. So should be able to see my desktop, and here we've got a graph. Okay, so what might happen is that you would be invited into the interview room, and I would show you this graph. And the first thing that we would kick off with is just to get a sense of your comprehension. Can you explain to us what you see here? So no trickery involved. We just want you to sort of have a look at the graph, consider it, and tell us what you see. Okay, so take it step by step. You don't need to rush through it. So you might just sort of carefully start with the title. So probability that a regime is democratic by per capita income. Have a look at the various axes. So along the x-axis, you can see that it says GNP/cap. Now remember, we're not testing your knowledge. So if you don't know what GNP per cap means, then make a mistake. It's perfectly acceptable to ask us for some clarification. And I would say, well, that stands for gross national product per capita. So that is the amount of national wealth for every member of that national society. Okay, so richer societies therefore would have higher GNP per capita than poorer societies. And then on the y-axis, you would see that there is a metric of the proportion of democratic countries. Okay, so we would together, not on your own, but together, the interviewer and the interviewee would get to a position where we would explain that this is a graph that demonstrates a positive correlation between GNP per capita, or a country's wealth, and its likelihood of being democratic. So that would be the first stage, is just to sort of comprehend what's going on. Okay, and that would be a collaborative exercise. This would not just be me as the interviewer sort of twiddling my thumbs until you reach that position. Okay, and then we would look into this more deeply. We would start to analyze some of the aspects of this. So we might start by just sort of thinking about some of the metrics that are used here. How, for example, can we establish that a country is democratic? What does it mean in broad terms for a country to be democratic? And how might you, if you were to become a political scientist, measure relative democracy around the world? Now, again, you don't need to know how this is actually done in political science, but you can start to sort of think about how it might be done in a systematic way, because this is a fundamental part of political science. We are trying to take very complex phenomena and measure them some way systematically. So how can I tell you, for example, that Britain is more democratic than Guinea-Bissau? What sort of confidence do I have in that conclusion? And so between us, we can discuss how you might measure democracy. And bear in mind that I am interested in you. So don't sort of scramble to find what some authority has done in the past. Have some confidence in yourself that if you think there's an intuitive answer to this question, then that's defensible. What's quite common is that students try and hide behind established authorities. They might quote some august figure from the past to try and protect themselves. But ultimately, we're interested in you and what you have to bring to the table. So you're not required to quote some great authority. And indeed, we would often encourage you to speak for yourself anyway, even if you did try and hide behind an august authority. Anyway, so we would discuss how we can measure these various phenomena, like democracy, and then we get into the actual hypothesis that's being tested here, that there is some sort of positive relationship between wealth in its specific measure, specifically wealth in 1985 at a particular point in time, and the likelihood that a country is democratic. And indeed, the graph can even tell us the tipping point where a country is equally likely to be democratic or not democratic relative to the particular wealth of that society. And we could start to discuss, well, why might that be? And you can explain to us why you think this pattern might have emerged in the data. Why might richer societies be more democratic? And you can unpack that problem from multiple angles, and we would encourage you to do so. So, for example, why might an individual who becomes a little bit richer, why might they become a little bit more predisposed to democratic politics? In other words, politics where they can't guarantee the outcome of a process because they have to share power with other people. Why would a richer person ever want to engage in more uncertain political structures? What could they possibly gain from that? These are the sorts of questions that we might ask. And then to try and develop the interview, once we've got through some of those theoretical components, we might ask you about some of the implications. So I might, for example, ask you, what are the implications of this model? Might it be that if we give lots of money in overseas aid to poorer countries, that we could expect them to become flourishing democracies within a short period of time? I might also ask you whether or not you think that this relationship could in fact be spurious, that it may be that there isn't a relationship between wealth and democracy, but that this map is showing some other relationship that's not being shown in these data. So there are various ways we can look through the data, but what is not required is that you know anything about how to measure these things, nor have you ever encountered this theory that there might be a connection between wealth and democracy. We're just trying to test your thinking skills and your ability to think critically. So if I ask you a question about the potential relationship between wealth and democracy, you can think about it for yourself and on your own terms. Okay, well, thank you very much, and I will pass on to Chris.
Okay, so hopefully you can see what's on the slides here. I'm going to be talking for a few minutes about economics admissions interviews. First thing I'd say, just as both Bill and Matt said, the interview is not intended as a test of prior knowledge. Okay, so it won't be based on anything that you might have studied in economics if you studied economics at school. It won't be asking you for the views of a particular economist that you might have read about in a book or something like that. Instead, the typical format would be that something like 30 minutes in advance of the interview, you would be asked to read a description of a problem or sometimes a short piece of text. You'd have the opportunity to make some notes whilst reading through that description of a problem or a short piece of text. And then during the interview, we would have a discussion about the material you've had roughly 30 minutes to think about. So the idea is that the discussion in an interview mimics what would happen in an Oxford tutorial. So you shouldn't worry if you can't solve the problem that's been set out in advance. We don't expect anyone to have a fully thought through solution to the problem that we've asked you to read about. Instead, what we'll be interested in hearing is some of the thoughts that you've had, and also about some of the difficulties that you encountered in working through those thoughts. So at the beginning, you'll set out what you have established regarding what you've read, and then the interviewers will help take you through some of the ideas that you've introduced, perhaps extend the principles that you've introduced a little bit, perhaps help you to critique some of those ideas. And during the discussion that takes place, what interviewers will be mainly interested in is observing your reasoning skills and your ability to process arguments and to understand certain ideas that are described to you and then apply those ideas in similar contexts or in other contexts. Okay, so that's the idea. Here I've got an example of an interview question that I used about 15 years ago. And the title of the problem is Dividing the Treasure. So you'd have about half an hour before the interview to read through this and make some notes, and then there would be a discussion of it during the interview. So I'll read through the details of this particular problem. So there are 5 pirates, A, B, C, D, and E, who have just stolen 100 gold coins, each of equal value. The problem that they now face is how to divide the treasure between them. The pirates agree to abide by the following procedure for allocating the coins. The oldest of the pirates, which is Pirate A, gets to propose a division of the coins amongst the 5 of them. The 5 pirates then vote either for or against the proposed allocation. Pirate A is free to vote for his or her own suggested allocation. If 50% or more of the votes are for the proposed allocation, it is accepted and the division of coins is implemented. If there is less than 50% support for the proposed allocation, Pirate A is forced to walk the plank, the worst outcome of all from his or her point of view. In the event that Pirate A is forced into the sea, the next most senior pirate, Pirate B, is asked to propose an allocation of coins, which is then voted upon by all 4 remaining pirates. The same rules as above then apply. If the proposal gets at least 50% support, it is implemented. but if it does not, then B walks the plank and C is asked to make a proposal. In theory, the process could continue along these lines until only the youngest of the pirates, Pirate E, is left. If this situation were to arise, Pirate E would of course just allocate all 100 coins to himself or herself. So at the start of the interview, you would have the opportunity to check anything that you'd read, clarify any points that you weren't sure about. And then we'd ask you to address the following question. What allocation of coins across the 5 pirates will Pirate A propose in order to ensure that he or she obtains the maximum number of coins without, of course, being forced to walk the plank? Okay, so at the start of the interview, you would present your ideas as to what you would do if you were Pirate A, and then we would offer you some feedback on those ideas and discuss some of the advantages and disadvantages of what you've suggested. Now, you may be asking yourself, what has any of this got to do with economics? Actually, quite a lot of the reasoning that you could apply here is similar to the reasoning that you might apply to problems that you would normally associate with economics. So Pirate A in this situation is undertaking a constrained optimization. They're thinking about how to maximize the number of coins that they walk away with, whilst at the same time not risking being forced into the sea because they're outvoted by all the other pirates. So there's a trade-off that has to be resolved by Pirate A when thinking about what offer to make to all of the other pirates. Okay, so just as individual consumers or individual firms might be undertaking a constrained optimization exercise based upon their monthly budget or something like that, these pirates are undertaking constrained optimization. So we'd think about what are good and bad proposals from the point of view of Pirate A and try to work out what is a possible solution to the problem given the very particular assumptions that are described here in the text. I don't really have time to work through what is the ideal strategy of Pirate A, but this particular problem has attracted some attention now. There's a Wikipedia page devoted to the pirates problem. So if you're interested in seeing some discussion of how Pirate A might behave in this situation, you could Google the pirates problem and read a little bit more about it online. Okay, I'll leave it there.
Okay, so thanks very much. We hope that's been helpful to you. But if you do decide to apply to PPE at Oxford and are invited to interview, we hope that this will have given you some ideas about what it'll be like, and above all, that it will have kind of put your mind at rest and made you think that it'll be an okay experience, maybe even an enjoyable experience, and not anything to be scared of. So thanks very much, and goodbye.